if we subjectively look at our mind right now, you will notice a stream of consciousness. Of course, right now we are in a fairly neutral, positive maybe state of mind, wanting to learn and read and understand something. But usually our mind is often choosing a path that is either wrong, extremely sort of very rigid in a one way, or one has a dilemma of not able to follow that choice and wanted to do the exact opposite. So these two extremes are the usually people choose, and if they think one is better than the other, so both, they don't know both are extremes. So they don't have the ability to find a middle way, and that's why these texts, the subject of these texts is how to enter into your stream of middle consciousness rather than the two extreme consciousness. And in this teaching, they talk about how to recognize the nihilist consciousness, the mind that deny things, reject things. So that's the nihilist kind of extreme. Or eternalist, when it hold onto something as totally, this is it, and therefore one wouldn't back off at all. One is so fanatical about what it is. Or the other one is completely denying the opposite. So one is nihilist, one is eternalist. These usually are the two most conflicting emotional instabilities that people experience on any subject for that matter. You don't have to be interested in spirituality because we are always dealing with our mind, but people who are not entering into the middle way, they don't think that it's anything to do with my mind. They think it's something to do out there that is either this or that, as if it's independently unable to compromise with anything, because one thinks it is the thing, or one is denying the exactly opposite. No, it's nothing to do with that. So either eternalists or nihilists. These are the two. Eternalist usually is holding on to something, and so as permanence and something rigid there, be it a thing or be it whatever one believes. And the nihilist is the exact opposite of it. So most of our problems, if not all of the problems, are usually caused by when our mind is falling into these two extremes. So hence, Chandrakirti's text called Entry to the Middle Way is how to learn to recognize those extremities and then find our third way. Because third way is safe, and it understand the mutually inclusive nature of the two extremes. So there's neither one is perfectly this, perfectly that. They're totally relative to each other. They don't see the relativity. So being able to see the relativeness of all things, and therefore being able to make peace with both, so to speak, and find a middle ground, what they call middle ground. We have progressed quite a bit in these texts. It has 10 chapters, and each of the 10 chapters is a gradation of how your mind is learning to take safer and sounder and more compassionate points of view. Yeah, and so therefore the thought and view that you choose to focus becomes somewhat based on the not only subjective and objective understanding of reality, and so if your purpose of the cultivating the middle way should be altruistic, beings who do not know these danger of the two extremes cause sufferings to themselves, and then they lay blame onto others. So the laying blame on others is eternalist, not taking any responsibility is nihilist. Or even sometimes they may say, it's all my fault. and then that's again exactly another eternalist. It's all, and so either of these two extremes are usually cause of all the distress and sufferings. So the middle way here is intentional middle way and philosophical middle way. Intentional middle way is altruism, on seeing the plight of sentient beings who do not know how to find the middle way, how to find a more safer way. It might take a little bit longer and definitely safer and more saner, but majority are so impatient to search for that. They're not seeking anything. They're not seeking the light and truth of things, because they're holding things, wrong things, as right things. And they grasp onto the self so much. The self-grasping and egotistical mind disallows oneself to even open the eyes. So this 10th chapter, therefore, is arranged in order to conceive the importance of altruism, because altruism, by definition, is the selfless, selflessly serving others, knowing how childish sentient beings are, and not knowing that they are kind of drowned into the self-created sufferings, karmically, emotionally, and cognitively. And then you feel compassionate to those beings who have lost their way, or maybe compassion to one's past, how one has lost one's way, and then has developed aversion and anger to things, or people, or events, or to oneself, and then belting oneself, and then become very depressed or very angry. And that is the result of the having lost to the extreme nihilist and eternalist view. And how to save sentient beings from this extreme self-caused suffering. This initiative is called altruism. So therefore, so the intentional middle way is based on altruism, and philosophical middle way is mainly how to reason, rationalize, to empower one's mind not to do that by reason and logic. So this text goes to develop many different levels, and so we are on the 6th chapter, and so we finished last week at page 282, which talks about how self, the point that ourself, is identical to the aggression, and so to aggregates rather. Aggregate means body, or feelings, or volition, or perception, and our consciousness. So with either of these five, people think I am, but they think I is body, I is identical, That's scriptures. The Buddhist scripture doesn't mean that I is identical to aggregates, but the internal argument is that people think the Buddhist teaching says that self is identical to the aggregates, because if self is identical to the aggregates, we will have the problem of having 5 aggregates, 5 selves, because there are 5 aggregates, and so on. So. And third, the object of abandonment, an antidote that would be confused if self were to be identical to the aggregates. So this will be now shown in these next 2 verses, verse number 140. So I read that verse in Tibetan. Dame tokse dakpe dakponshin dine nganzin jikden tuam mindopa teche dame shebe dakdava jikan jinshi mawa shintu tsar. So the translation of that verse reads, some think that when no self is understood, this means the refutation of the permanent existing self. But our ego clinging, but of our ego clinging, this could never be the ground. How strange to say that understanding this suffices to uproot the belief in I. So this is the within the Buddhist school. One Buddhist school called actually the Samathiya school believes that the self and aggregates are identical. This school states that when a realized being believes selflessness, philosophically, selflessness, he does not realize imprints or emptiness of the aggregates. If the self and aggregates were to be identical, then you would see the emptiness of self, and you should also see the emptiness of aggregates. But that is not the case according to the Samathiya school. When selflessness is realized, it is not the aggregates that are negated. It is the permanent self, notion of the permanent soul or permanent self, which is imputed by non-Buddhist schools, such as the Sankhya school. So what is negated is the permanent self, not the self identical to the aggregate. Now, is this permanent self the basis of grasping at I? You know, the grasping that at I is this so-called permanent self. They say no, of course. That is not held to be the basis of group grasping at I. The basis of grasping at I is the self identical to the aggregates. In other words, the opponent school, whether intentionally or not, seems to establish two kinds of self. One is the self identical to the aggregates, and other is imputed self, which is permanent and so on. According to them, when worldly beings grasp I, they are grasping the aggregates. At that point, self and aggregate are the same, but when it comes to stage when you realize selflessness, you are not negating the self that is identical to the aggregates. In fact, you are not negating the aggregates at all. You are only negating the permanent self, and that permanent self is negated only at the time of realizing selflessness. Permanent self will not function as the basis of grasping at I. The basis of grasping at I is identical to the aggregates. Now, the Madhyamika, this is the middle way. Middle way school responds by saying, it is amazing that you say that permanent self is not the object of self-grasping. Yet when you realize selflessness, you realize negation of permanent self, but still you say that by realizing the non-existence of self, you have abandoned self-grasping. By your reasoning, when you negate that permanent self, you will still be left with a self that is identical to the aggregates. So you will not have abandoned self-grasping. You will still be left with the other self that is identical to the aggregates and which you have not negated through your realization of selflessness. So continuing with the next verse, by an analogy, Rankim tsikpu dunan tongshindu dina langje meje toksate Dujin jigban pomar chebane gema hengi number kyurnito. He says, for this is like a man who finds a snake's nest in his wall and overcomes his fright by saying it is not an elephant. A method such as this to cure one's dread of snakes, alas, it's one's sure to be the laughing stock. So this is it's just arguing with the Samathiya school. Saying Madhyamika, the middle way, Madhyamika is middle way saying that opponent's theory is just like that. If there were a snake in the corner of your room and you try to allay the fear of that snake by saying there is no elephant in the room, you would naturally become laughing stock of others. The snake is an analogy. A snake in analogy represents aggregates. When one realizes selflessness, the self is still there, just like the snake. In the same way, negating the permanent self is like saying that there is no elephant. You are trying to overcome your fear of the snake by saying there is no elephant. In other words, by saying that the permanent self is negated, you are saying that you have eliminated all self-grasping. That is not possible. You are negating something else, and in so doing, you do not get rid of the other thing. As long as you do not negate the self completely, self-grasping remains. In other words, self-grasping will remain so long as you do not get rid of grasping of the self identical to the aggregates. This is the main point. Simply eradicating the permanent self will not eliminate self-grasping because the self identical to the aggregate will still be grasped. So this now completes the presenting criticism to the notion that self is identical to the aggregate. So it's not. Now we have negating them as supported and supported. Now this is additional points of by Nagarjuna. By Chandrakirti. The previous points were all covered also by Nagarjuna. Support and supported. Yeah, theory that self is identical to the aggregates has already been negated by these reasonings. Now the third is to negate self and aggregate as support and supported. This is covered in the next verse. It's 풍보 다요 마이 달라양 유 풍보 테남 유미 당강실데 신이 요나 똑반들 유나 신이 테메 대신데 똑바오스. Self is not inherent in the aggregates, nor aggregates inherent in the self. And why? It might be so if they were separate and distinct. But they are not distinct, and therefore this is but an idle notion. So this proposition is that aggregates are supported and the self is the support. But this is not the correct. The support and supported theory would be valid only if you consider the self and aggregate as separate. If they are not, if there were other, then this conceptualization would be valid. But it has already been proved that self and aggregate are not separate. So not separate because you can't call self without aggregates. So therefore they're not separate. They're totally dependent. Therefore, these notions have no validity. So negating self as possessing the aggregate. Now this is shown by showing this is shown by how the self as possessing aggregates. So if they are separate, if they're not identical, maybe self possesses the aggregate. So this is the whole concept of what is the relationship between self and aggregate. This is shown by the next verse. This is very big verse, I will see. 다는 숭데 민도 간신다 유민 대신 된든 저와메 셴은 난데 힘인 숭데나 다는 술에 되니 셴니도. So self cannot be said to own aggregates of form. Because if you say, then the self has to be separate from the form that it owns, The self does not exist. For self does not exist, thus ownership is void of sense. Void of sense. One owns a cow in difference or one's body in identity. But self and form are neither same nor different. Coming back to that. First of all, self does not exist. This is what the point is. When we think self exists, then we go into one of the extremes. Since it does not exist, it cannot own anything. But we think we own the aggregate, my aggregate. So because we don't know the self doesn't exist, it looks like there is a kind of innate I that owns the aggregates. It cannot own anything. When something owns another thing, that something has to exist in the first place. It must be either identical to the thing possessed or separate from the thing possessed. But in the case of self, it is not so. Take the example of one person, Devadatta. Now, Devadatta. One might say, giving a conventional example, that Devadatta owns a cow. So Devadatta could be Roger, or doesn't have to be Devadatta. You don't have to try to look at what is Devadatta. It's just Devadatta happened to be a name. Because it could be Roger or Tim or Mary or whatever. Mary owns a cow. Maybe. So Mary and cow are two separate things. They are other than each other. If they are two separate things, one can own the other. John owns books. That is acceptable because they are separate. If they are identical, it could also be possible. For example, we might say Devadatta owns form. Devadatta has form, feeling, and mind, etc. Form, feeling, mind, etc. are not separate from Devadatta. On that basis, from the convention point of view, they might be considered the same. In that case, one could say the Devadatta owns form. If they were other or separate, it would be possible to say that something owns something else, such as Devadatta owns cows. But the self is neither one with no other than form, so it cannot be said to own a form. Remember, we were saying the form, self was only named after, but it isn't a thing separate. Because of that, it cannot own anything. But when we have the wrong view, we think we own. We think the self is independent of anything, and therefore it owns things, and therefore it has suffering. It has all these things because it's a misconception of self itself. It's not misconception of suffering, but it's misconception of self as truly existing, and therefore it creates the suffering. But the self is neither one with no other than form, so it cannot be said to own a form. Since it cannot own a form, neither can it own any of the aggregates. It cannot own a feeling. It cannot own a consciousness, and so on. But at the same time, we always think like that. My aggregate, my form, my feeling. And so that's why we develop 20 wrong conceptions. 20 wrong conceptions. 4 wrong conceptions to each of the 5 aggregates. So that's what they call mountains of 20 wrong conception comes from this. Therefore, self cannot be said to possess aggregates. So because we are learning this Madhyamika, it will explain how the 20 mountains of wrong views comes from this notion of self owning those 5 aggregates. These are just the supplementary conceptualization arising from the self being identical to or separate from aggregates. Once you negate the self as identical with or separate from the aggregate, these conceptualization will not arise. But even if one were to think along these lines, this is also rejected because self is neither identical to nor separate from the aggregates. So the self does not possess any of the aggregates, any of the aggregate. This cover explaining at length the reasoning for negation. The five alternatives are the self being identical to the aggregate, separate from the aggregates, support of the aggregate or supported by the aggregate, and self being possessor of aggregates. Yeah, these are the 5. This is very important philosophically to understand that. It has been established through reasoning that self does not exist in any of these 5 alternatives. But we think it does. Exact the wrong way. That is explaining at length the reasoning for negation. Now, second is presenting definitive number of self-grasping in summary. That's what 20 mountains of the wrong view we're talking about. So definitive number. This is covered in next 2 verses. When you do Vajrayana meditation or something, they say, this something like, this represent 20 mountains of the wrong view, this is what they're talking about, how the 20 mountains of wrong views are the wrong views that develop in association with 5 aggregates by an association with self, whether self has aggregates or self is in aggregates and so on. Sugda mayin dane sugde min sula dame dalan suye min tetarnamshi pungun sheja de tedar datu tawa nishurndo. See, he says, form is not I, and I is not form possessor. So it's not itself, it's not a possessor. There's no I in form. So that's in form. And form does not inhere in I. See, this is the 4. That's the 4. That's the 4, yeah? Apply this now to all the other 4 aggregates, yeah? If you apply that, then you will have the 20 views of self, yeah? 20 wrong views of self. Of course, we don't call wrong views. We say 20 views of self. Sounds like good. Oh, 20 ways of looking at self-existence. So that's boosted. That maybe we are very well boosted to think I exist because we view ourselves from that point of view. And now the explanation of this is this: there is mention of 20 views of the self in the scriptures, sometimes called 20 mountains of the wrong views, not just 20 views. 20 mountains are wrong, because you have to destroy the mountain. You have to pulverize the mountain. Pulverize the mountains. It is said that even in the Theravada, or when a practitioner attains stage of stream entry, he has abandoned 20 types of self-grasping, 20 views of the self, or 20 mountains of the wrong view. Because self is a mountain of problem. Mountain of problem when it has the wrong view. But if self is understood, there's not even particle of problem. There's no particle of problem that truly exists. There's no problem whatsoever. I don't know what we're talking about. There's no problem whatsoever. But out of sand particles, they make mountains, don't they? The sedimented particles become mountains. So that's why all the particles makes little rocks, and rocks are sedimented, and they become mountains. Because actually, there's no rock in the mountains. There's only particles in the mountain. There's actually no particle even in the particle when you look for the partless particles. Now, what are the 20 views of the self? So this is a question. It is explained here that first it is shown from the negative point of view, form is not self, up to form is not within the self. So that's this should be applied to all other aggregate also with respect to, there are four in fact, yeah, four in each of the five aggregates, yeah. That form is in the I, and then all feeling is in the I. That form is or perception is in the I, or volition is in the I, or consciousness in the I. So that's in the I, and then I is and I is not a possessor of, or a form possessor. Yeah? I is not a form possessor. But yet we think I am possessor of my form. You know? I have my feeling. You know? People say I'm my feeling. You know? People don't complain unless they think the feeling is theirs. You know, if it's someone's feeling, they don't really have a problem. It's their feeling. Then it's a problem because they think they self-possess the feeling. You know, there is no I in form. You know, like say this stick, or this. I mean, if you look at this drumstick, I don't know whether it's a drumstick or gong stick. It hasn't got an inherent name from its own side. It's just we just have to even think again what to call it, depending what this is related to other thing than itself. So there's no independently this being anything, but depending what it is in relation to something else. You know. If it's next to a drum, maybe called drumstick, but then they call chicken legs also drumstick, you know. So they say you can't. So there's no inherent drumstick, even chicken drumsticks, the least drumstick. This probably is at least is a stick, and you might even be able to beat on the drum. So there's not in the name, no self in the name. There's just merely concocted concept, but actually the thing itself lacks any entity called self that from its own side. So form is not self. Form is not the self. Self means I. Up to form is not within the self. This should be applied with all the with respect to form. There are four in fact. Now this is from the negative. If you take the 20 views of self, not 20 views of selflessness. This is not 20 views of selflessness. 20 views of self itself. Then we will have to have self is identical to form. So that's one. Yeah. Self-possessed form. That's two. Self is within form, that's three, and form is within self, that's four. Yeah, so if you apply that with the other four aggregates, that's how you get to. These are the four alternatives or four things, and these four, as explained in the case of form, should be applied to all the other aggregates also. There are five aggregates, and each one of these four types of viewing with respect to I, and that makes 20 views of the self. So 20 wrong views, of course. But when we don't know it's wrong, when we 20 views of the self, yeah. Now you will realize that there's no mention of self being separate from the aggregates. Separate from aggregates. This is because 20 views of self are based on the grasping of self that is connected to the aggregates. Yeah, only in connection with aggregates we call I in self, I of self. So, self being in aggregate being in us, and so on. Self being separate from aggregate has nothing to do with aggregates. So the Indian Sankhya school and others believe the self is separate from the aggregates. Hence, the aggregate have nothing to do with the self, but the view that self is separate from aggregates is not included in this scheme of 20 views of self. The 20 views of self have only the views that relate to the aggregates. So without aggregates, you can't talk about self at all because there's no separate self, separate self. If you grasp the self as identical to aggregates, then aggregates are again related. Yeah. If you say that self possess aggregates. Self-possessed aggregates. In a wrong view, it does, because we say my leg, my hand, my feeling, my job, my accomplishment, my lateness, my failure. we plenty of them. So that's why we got plenty of sufferings because we are all over the 20 wrong views all the time. 20 all over the 20 wrong views, and we don't even think it's wrong. Nobody say, "Oh, that's not your pot." And if self is within the aggregates or the aggregates are within the self, in both cases aggregates are related. So they are not independent, they are related. All those self-grasping views, 20 of them, of self related to aggregate are categorized as 20 views of the self. So 20 views of the self. You will often, if you subjectively look at sometimes, if you're angry or if you're upset or you're even happy at some things, you're happy with the business success or something. Oh, that was such a good deal. Oh, let's go and have a drink. Let's go and have it. It's of course my idea that worked. So this is sort of my thing that worked. So all of those things, you can see that nobody would say that is a problem because that's how samsara works. Samsara is lumped together with I and everything confused. And they don't see because they don't see the suffering as suffering. They see this suffering as pleasure, and they see the impermanent as permanent, and non-existent as existent, and a non-possessor as a possessor, and also having possessions. So because it is like that, it doesn't have another way of looking at it. So therefore, it's called 20 views of the self. Now here we are trying to break down those mountains. So that's why next verse goes to say, "Tari dame tokbe dorji jomda kanda lenjing jigyurwa jigso tari lundu lanebe tsemo towargyuwan didako." To realize no self is the Vajra. Vajra is this adamantine thunderbolt, thunderbolt that will break the mountain into pieces. So the right view that you get, that's sometimes called the Vajra view, adamantine view, that Vajra is regarded as something that breaks everything, but it doesn't get broken by anything. So that Vajra that destroys the mountain chain, the sense of I, and when this goes, that its towering peak will also fall. So the ego, it's all of this will fall. The 20 views that rise upon the mighty range, the transitory composite, the I. Transitory composite is the transient collection, the aggregates of body, feeling, all this collected, aggregated together. But if you undo it, the physical form aggregates self, the skin, the flesh, and bones, and marrows, everything doesn't look a mountain. None of them look like mountains. So when they hold together. So therefore, Here, to explain the meaning of this verse, this refers to the analogy of a Vajra. Vajra is the thunderbolt, yeah, thunderbolt. In the Vajrayana, we have actually Vajra thing, the Vajra itself. That's the Vajra. That's Vajra. And so in the Mahayana school, they say it's like an idea that is very powerful, that destroys the wrong view. So the idea of Vajra, the emptiness is like a Vajra, because they call diamond cutter. They call diamond cutter sutra, The sutra, teaching itself is that can cut the diamond. The diamond cutter is the thunderbolt, if you like, yeah? So what is that? That's the teaching. That's the perfection of wisdom. Perfection of wisdom. And so he says that Vajra destroying the huge mountain with 20 high sharp peaks, egos. So the mountain means stable. It means it's difficult to climb, let alone destroy and pulverize it. So all our sufferings, the wrong views, come from this mountain of 20 peaks, 5 peaks, 20 high peaks. Indra. So according to Indology, Indra, the god Indra, is said to have one who owns this thunderbolt. What he carries in his hand is the thunderbolt, Vajra. And that can destroy all the mountains, The Vajra that destroys the mountain with the 20 peaks symbolize the wisdom realizing selfless. Now in Buddhism and Mahayana, the Vajra that destroys those mountains are just that's analogy. The actual mountains is the mountain of the problems. It's not a mountain of mountains, mountain of problems. People have problems of feeling something so strong to something, and then they just don't know how to unstuck it. They're just stuck with some feelings. And it's a mountain of problem. They go 20 years of counseling, still the mountain has no sign of breaking into pieces. It become even more sedimented. Why? Because they're so enmeshed in things, lumping things together. The mountain that is destroyed is self-grasping. Yeah, not grasping to the aggregates of me or mine, doing as mine or doing as his. A lot of people's problem is he did this to me. That's a mountain of volition, mountain of wrong view with the volition. He did that to me, and therefore I suffer. So they did this to me, or they didn't do this to me, and they are suffer. So therefore, aggregator of volition. We lump the action of many people, but we we lump the action just to one. Just to one. We don't realize so many things other than the thing there, but we see it's truly existing. Him or her or them that create this to me, and therefore we are completely lumped, and we are solely lumped with this action of others or one's own, and therefore the mountain of suffering is now completely sedimented. So mountain has a meaning of it's just so aggregated. Because mountains are aggregated dust, aggregated sand, and so on. These days they have this. These days there's all the people who chop trees. They bring the machine, all the trees and logs they put in the thing. Quickly, all they become chips, and then there's no. So we're talking about getting such a machine to pulverize the ego with all the lumps of feelings and self and everything like that. When you understand this, that's the Manjushri sword of wisdom. Is that's going to cut down, or that's going to break down, like the Vajra that will break down, hammer everything, self-grasping. Mountain that is destroyed is the self-grasping. In general, this is the spontaneously arising self-grasping. This is the innate self-grasping, which exists within every sentient being. This, not even think it's I, not even suspect that I shouldn't say I. It's unhesitatingly say I and me and mine and I saw and There's no doubt. Nobody would keep quiet. So it's just suspecting I shouldn't say I because it may not be I. Spontaneously, the view of transitory composite. The view of transitory composite means that view of aggregate that is the view of self. And one's body, one's shoes is mine, one's house is mine, and then it gets wet. Oh, my house shoes are wet, and if it's not mine, it's okay, and all that sort of thing. So terrible. So if the wetting is the problem, then any shoes is a problem. But no, no, it's not mine. It's leave it there. If yours, go out and get it and put it in the bag. So the self-grasping is very, very constant. Yeah? You can notice, you can witness the self-grasping. The 20 high peaks are imputed self-grasping. Yeah, imputed self-grasp, imputed with those 4 things, with each of the 25 aggregates, 4 times 20. Whereas main mountain is the spontaneous arising self-grasping. Main mountain is the innate I, innate I, just unquestionable. These 20 types of self-grasping are also destroyed by the Vajra, together with that mountain when a person realizes and attains the stage of stream enterer. So when a practitioner meditates, he enters the stream of consciousness of no self. And when he practices meditation, he enters no self. He doesn't feel the body as me. Then the hunger and thirst and craving for food and desire diminishes. Because of that, the body will go weaker, but the spirit or consciousness that is meditating has no attachment and craving for food or attachment to the body or aversion to the heat or cold. Because he hasn't got that, therefore the body doesn't die totally, because his fifth aggregate for consciousness is able to enter the stream entry. In the case of the Theravada practice and in the case of Mahayana practice, when one attains the first bhumi. So when a person attains the first bhumi, attaining enlightenment, then they are now able to destroy the mountain. That is why this section is known as emptiness to be realized by practitioners of all 3 vehicles, realizing emptiness. So realizing emptiness of self. Realizing emptiness of self. In the case of Mahayana, one attains the strong wisdom realizing selflessness on the first bhumi. First bhumi is the first stage of enlightenment. Together with the spontaneous self-grasping, one also abandons these imputed self-grasping. Because the innate self-grasping is not imputed after body or any feeling. It's just bare I. Bare I, yeah? Bare I. That is the meaning. That is the meaning of what is referred to in the scriptures as 20 types of self-grasping or 20 views of self. The definitive number of self-grasping means 20 views of the self. So this completes the negating existence of person as 5 alternatives. The second, on top of that, so these 5 alternatives already mentioned by Nagarjuna as well. The second is negating an inexpressible person. These 2 subdivisions show that. First is presenting the notion of inexpressible person, then presenting the criticism. The presenting the notion or the theory is shown by the next verse, which is Kachik teni sheni tak meta laso jome kansa zeyonde namshi tuki sheja dendojing denenganzin shiryang debayim. Some say the self is indestructible. Indestructible. Inexpressible. Indescribable. That's what they got. Indescribable or inexpressible. Not other than the aggregates, nor yet the same, not permanent, nor changing. It is yet a real, substantial person, cognized by 6-fold consciousness. It is the base for clinging to the I. So this is talking about thinking about the self is inexpressible. So self shouldn't be expressible. This is the 6th point. Now, actually, the Buddhist school that believes in the self as identical to the aggregates, the theory that it was refuted early is the Samadhiya school. This was one of the four main schools that included in the Sarvasvistada, Staviravada, and Mahasangika. In all, there were 18 branches of such Nikaya sub-schools. Now, within the Samathiya school, there's another sub-school that is known as Vasitputra school, which believes in the existence of these inexpressible persons. So this is within Buddhist school debate here. They say that there is substantially existing self. Now, that sort of self is that. Now, what sort of self is that? The inexpressible one, yeah? Is it permanent, impermanent? Is it produced, or what? Now, this is Madhyamaka challenging this school. When asked whether it is the same as the aggregate or separate from the aggregates, permanent or impermanent, they answer that it is indescribable. Yeah. They say you can't explain. It can't be described in these terms, but despite this, it still exists substantially. It's not a concept that the Yogacara school would uphold. So the mind-only school, Yogacara school, would not subscribe to that. It is an object of knowledge of the sixth consciousness. Yeah, it still is an object of knowledge. It's still knowable. The sixth consciousness can apprehend this kind of self. It is also the basis of grasping at I. In other words, this school is saying that which worldly beings normally grasp as self is inexpressible. So that's the Vastiputra school. This school called Vastiputra. It is substantially existing, but it is indescribable. This is refuted in the next point, which has three subdivisions. It cannot be substantial if it is inexpressible. It should be existent through imputation if it were inexpressible, and it cannot be an entity without having the characteristic of an entity. So these are the 3 points. The first point is it should be existing. First point shown is by next verse, which is Kanche sugle semje me tokpa ngoy jeme tokpa maingi kade dangai ngoy pro drubjuna semdar drungo jode me mingyur. So a mind distinct from body cannot be accounted inexpressible. A thing that is existing cannot be regarded as beyond expression. If one could show that self is an existing thing, it would be real, like mind, and not at all ineffable. If something is claimed to be indescribable, you cannot also claim that it is substantial. To do so would be contradictory. That is what Chandrakirti is saying. You do not assert mind to be indescribable. With respect to form is a thing that exists substantially, according to opponent school. You don't say that form exists, but it's indescribable. You assert form as describable because it is a substantially existing thing. In the same way, you should not assert existing thing to be indescribable. Just as you do not say that form is indescribable, you also should not call indescribable anything that you describe as substantially existing. Now, if self exists as a thing, it must be describable because the existing things are not indescribable. Form, feeling, etc. are considered to be existing things. They are considered to be substantially existing, thus they are not indescribable. They are described as between permanent or impermanent, or impermanent but produce and not produce. Produce, that is how they are asserted to be substantially existing. If self is believed to be substantially existing thing, it should not be accepted as indescribable. it should be describable. That is the meaning of the first verse. Now the second is that it should be existing through imputation if it were indescribable, inexpressible. This is described in the next verse, which says, "Kanchi ki pum ngopor madrupe ngovo suksoju leju mengyurwe dakang pungbo leju mengyurde rangi yopur trupa domeja." A pot, which is in itself not a self-sufficient entity, meaning you say is indescribable apart from the form and other features. Self is also indescribable apart from aggregates. Do not therefore regard it as inherently existing. If you say that something is indescribable, you should not claim it as substantial. You should accept it as imputed, such as a pot, and form. Form is the basis upon which pot is formed according to opponent's school, not according to Madhyamika school. According to Madhyamika, there is no difference between pot and the form aggregate self as far as existence is concerned. They are equal. With respect to the opponent, forms are considered as substances. They are the basis of all these imputed things. So the form, smell, these atoms exist substantially. That's why it is mentioned in the earlier verse that if there is a form, you don't say that a thing is indescribable. It exists substantially and is therefore describable. In the case of something that is indescribable, it should be considered to be imputed, such as a pot, which is an entity that does not substantially exist. A pot is just an imputed thing. Pot is an imputed thing, meaning it's not a pot from its own side. If it's imputed, then it is described, it's a description. It is imputed on the collection of substance, form, smell, taste, the collection of atoms. A pot can be called indescribable with respect to the form and so forth. If it were to be asked whether the pot is the same as its form, its shape, or its color, we can say that since a pot is just imputed and not a substantial entity, it can be said that it is neither the same nor separate. This can be said because it is an imputed thing and not a substantial entity. Therefore, you should not assert an indescribable self, because self is described, Now, if self is believed to exist by itself, to exist substantially, it should not be asserted as indescribable with respect to its aggregate. Otherwise, it would be like a pot, not substantially existing, just an imputed thing. Third, it cannot be an entity without having the characteristic of an entity that is shown by next verse. Kyugyenamshi rangda lashene mindu suso leshe ngoyondojing. You do not think your consciousness is different from itself, but think it is distinct from form and other aggregates. In all existing things, these aspects of distinction and identity are found, and so there is no self. It lacks the character of real existence. The two characteristics of a substantial entity are that with respect to its own quality, it can be said to be the same. It can be said to be identical with its own qualities, but with respect to other things, it can be said to be separate. In the case of consciousness, its own nature are not separate. You do not assert consciousness is other than its own nature. You can assert consciousness identical to its own nature because consciousness is substantial, so with respect to its own nature, we can say that it is identical, in the same as its own nature. With respect to other things such as form and so on, we can say the consciousness is other than form. This is because consciousness is a substantial thing. Now, in a substantial thing, we can find these two characteristics. The characteristic being one with one's own nature and that of being separate from other things. If self were to be a substantial thing, it should also have these two characteristics, but the self does not have these two characteristics because you have already said it is indescribable. So if you say it is indescribable, you should not accept it as a substantial entity in the same way. In this way, describable self is negated. Yeah. So I think he got the point. This complete the negating substantial person through reasoning. Second is establishing dependently imputed person. Now, imputed person. This has 3 points. The first is it becomes imputedly existing through previous reasoning. That is shown with this next verse. 대실 nganzi jikden ngoyoyomi 풍래심이 풍봉오민 풍보 때민 때는 된되민 되는 풍보남된 rubergurs. Thus, the basis of our clinging to an I is not a thing. Yeah. And though no other than aggregates, self is not the aggregate themselves either. Yeah, so repeat. It does not own the aggregates. That's the third point. The aggregates are not contained by it. That's the fourth point. So, yet, independent on aggregate, does self arise. So those are the four we were talking before, how the self identify with the aggregates, how each of the aggregates, whether it owns the aggregate, whether it is not contained, or whether it's dependent on it, or aggregate does not arise. So these 4 points, through various reasons, we have reached the conclusion that self is not a substantial entity. Self is not other than the aggregates. It is not other than. It is not the same. It does not depend on the aggregates, and it does not possess them. So basically, you are able to, if you identify this. Self is not other than aggregates is point number 1, because if you are, you have to be separate than aggregates. So that's quite. It is not other than. It is not other than. It is not the same. Yeah. If it's the same, then of course there are 5 aggregates, 5 self, and 20, and so on. It does not depend on upon the aggregates. Yeah. It does not depend on the aggregates, yeah, and it does not possess them. So how can you find anything like that? It exists dependent upon the aggregates. The self is not within the aggregates, and aggregates are not within the self, because by the time you look, you can't see one as a container and another as a content. By the time you remove the aggregates, where's the self? If you look all over the 5 aggregates, you can't find the self as a container or content. Content. This is the same thing. Same as saying that self does not depend on the aggregates, and the aggregates do not depend upon the self. It is same as the idea of support and supported. That is not the same as what we generally call existing by depending upon aggregate. Yeah. Yeah, this is we're talking about labeling. That is another thing. The proposition that self depends upon the aggregate is negated here, because that is to say the aggregates are like the support and the self is the supported. It is like ball containing rice. Rice is supported. The ball is the support. They are separate from each other. So you can actually see one is the container, and the rice is the supported. Rice is the content. But when you say the aggregates, when you see the aggregates, you can't find the self that is like the rice. At least rice is more substantial than the I. Or the earth is supported. Earth is the support, and animate and inanimate things are supported. We are supported by the earth, but are different. The support and supported are different. Now, the self and aggregate are not are also unrelated in that respect. Yeah, there is no there's not like that with self and aggregate. The proposition that self is something like the rice and the aggregates are like the ball, is not acceptable. So he said this analogy doesn't apply. It is not a support and supported. That is the meaning of aggregates are not contained by it. Yeah, aggregate are not contained by self. That's one of the mountains. Yeah. But other than that, it exists depending on means it is not necessarily separate. Again, it does not have to be separate in order to depend on something else. When you exist by depending on something else, you naturally do not have both sameness and otherness from that thing. The self is considered, self is considered as neither same or other than the aggregates. Why? Because it exists independent upon them. It is imputed by depending on the aggregates, but depending on the aggregate does not form, but depending on the aggregate does not form a separate entity. Separate. They are not separate entities like the rice and the bowl. That is what is meant when it says self is not within the aggregates and the aggregates are not within the self. This is not the same as yet independent on the aggregates does self arise. So it's a very fine difference. The next is establishing dependently imputed person. So this is now on top of all those confusions. Then how does a person become temporarily, nominally existing by imputation? First, it becomes imputedly existing through previous reasoning, and second, this is compared to the analogy of horse cart. It has two divisions. Now that's horse cart comes back again. The first is the brief presentation, and second is the detail. The brief presentation shown by this verse is a "Xingta rangye la le xian de min, xian min mai tende yang min xing, yen la mai yen la tende me, du ba zan min yib min chi xin no." We cannot claim our chariot is other than its parts, nor that it is their owner, nor identical with them. It is not in its parts. Its parts are not contained in it. It's not the mere collection of the parts, nor yet their shape. So this, of course, was the most famous way of analogy. I think it's very, very important analogy. It makes so many parts to it. And it says, just as the self does not exist in 7 ways with regard to aggregates, the chariot is also non-existing through the analysis of 7 reasonings. Now, so this whole summation of all the arguments so far now comes back to the 7 reasonings. This is known as Chandrakirti's 7-point reasoning. The 5-point reasoning was already explained earlier. We went through. By this, the self is not the same, not the other, not supported, not possessed by, and not possessing aggregates. So that's Nagarjuna used these analysis 5 alternatives in the root text, and so Chandrakirti has kept them as they are. But Chandrakirti has added 2 on top of these 5 to this. The collection and the shape. So he has added these 2 additional points about the collection of the points and the shape of the self is not the collection of aggregates. It is not the shape of the collection of aggregates. It is known as 7-point reasoning of a horse cart. This is a philosophical analogy. It is shown very clearly in this verse that concludes. And the brief presentation, the detailed explanation. So detailed explanation has to be. He's talking. Kempo is first explaining. Without explaining brief, he goes to detail. Detailed explanation has 2 subdivisions: asserting analogy and applying it to the meaning. The first is asserting analogy has 3 subdivisions. First, it is not substantial if analyzed by 7-point reasoning. This is 2 subdivisions. First, by mere collection is not the horse cart. Second is collective shape is not the horse cart. This is very important because people think there's everything. This is this. Look at this. This you can have every proof. It is your fault type of thing. They're looking at the color or shape or something. So he's talking about if all these 7 points are not there. There is no mere shape is not the horse cart. The collective shape is not the horse cart. The first mere collection is not the horse cart, is illustrated by the first two lines. It's a kaltet tsotsam hingder gyurnane sirwunela hingder niyungyuru. Now, if the chariot consisted in a mere collection of its parts, yeah, the scattered fragments likewise would comprise the chariot. Yeah, so it's talking about, because there are some parts, then if that's what it is, then there will be the chariot would be there within the fragments. Again, it is further clarified through the analogy of the card. It was already mentioned that the collection is not the self. So in the case of this analogy, the mere collection of the parts is not the card. Yeah. Otherwise, the card would exist in pieces of it that remain. If one had a collection of various individual pieces, one should be able to find the card, but that this is not possible. So the mere collection is not the card. It's the jigsaw puzzle. 2 pieces missing. All the other 98 pieces are there, and 2 other pieces missing. So 98 pieces also doesn't make the puzzle. It needs all the other puzzle, you reckon? Yeah, I reckon, yeah. But I would think if there's no board that holds it, there's no puzzle whatsoever, Even if you got all the 100 pieces, but if you haven't got a board to put on, a floor to put on, see? So therefore, we are usually counting on few things, and then we're lumping everything. And this is self, this is he did, this is I didn't do, this is your failure, and then we lump it, and then we go into the nihilist, I didn't do anything, it's all there's every proof, you left a fingerprint there type of thing. Then eternalist, the other one is completely, because there's a little few fragments there, and it's all him. And one doesn't want to have any share of responsibility, how one may maybe frightened them or whatever. One doesn't want to take any responsibility. That's nihilist. So these are the two wrong views, two extreme views: nihilist and eternalist, and then do not go have willingness to go a middle way, saying no, it's not entirely your fault, poor thing. It's I too have a small role to play. Let's not think like this. This is very, Then you are not aggressive to the other. You're very, very compassionate. Then you are very altruistic. So then you are able to see the whole thing, and not being so right and wrong. And because right and wrong is not middle way. Middle way is neither right nor wrong. Because right and wrong are relative to each other, mutually inclusive. So there's no exclusively right or exclusively wrong. It's only right. Black is among only non-blacks, not black among black. And among the black, he's a black. Or whatever. Tall is not tall. Tall is not tall among tall. It might be short. And tall is only tall among many short. Fast is only fast among many slow ones. But itself could not be fast, you see. But when you see only few factors that are hallmark of what he did or what I didn't do, we think that's truly existing. That's the small few fragments of the card makes the whole card, and then one perceives things. What one thinks, it appears, and then we zoom straight away. We create the wrong view, and of course. Yeah, of course. Then the innate ego comes in, and pride, because that if you're denying you did anything, that's pride. If you can prove they are wrong, that's pride. So all the 5 afflictions are part of the 20 mountains. 20 mountains are all the sands are all wet and then lumped together by all the afflictions. Affliction make all the particles hold together. And the grasping is the one cement of all of them, and then it appears. So we have to see this, not just look at philosophically, just like the card only, but only, okay, what the card of my life or my issue about that issue. When you see few points, when you think that's the whole thing, you don't want to see any other points. So when you have the danger of blaming someone entirely or eternalistically, saying it's all you did, you're solely responsible, sometimes people do that even to themselves. It's all my fault, and then they blame themselves like anything. It's eternalist, and some who don't take any responsibility themselves but pointing finger at others, it's eternalist there, but nihilist here, and none of the understanding of the needing to have all parts of the cards. Even all the parts of the cards are completely in a bag, but still there is no card yet because it hasn't been assembled. Shape is not there, and so on. Whatever, if the shape isn't there, you can't say card, because usually when you buy a box, or you don't know what it is, you have to look at the description of what it is, look at the diagram on the box, what it is. When you assemble it after taking 2 hours, then you might have a table or a chair or a desk or whatever, but it is actually is many bits and pieces there, But if you don't follow the steps of assembling them, it's not there. So that shows how we often fall into the extremes of seeing few parts of the cards as the card. Even all the pieces of parts, in the parts of the parts are there of the card. Still, if we don't label it, it doesn't. So that's why what here we're talking about is the imputation. Yeah. Otherwise, card would exist in the pieces of that it remain. If one had a collection of various individual pieces, one would be able to find the card, but that it is not possible. So the mere collection is not the card. So what makes the card possible with all the parts if the mere collection of the parts is not the card? Collective shape is not the horse card. Collective shape is not the horse card, but this has 4 divisions. First is the collective shape is not the horse card because there are 2 parts. The next 2 lines illustrate that. Yeah. But if there is no owner of the parts, there are no parts. There are no parts. And neither can the shape or simple pattern constitute it, Like somebody's garage, There's so many useful things, but they're all over the place. So you have to spend your time getting it out and putting pieces together, and then you might you paint it and you repair it. Then there might be a toy or a golf club or whatever. So that is in fact referring to the shape of all the parts. In order to have a shape, we first must have the existence of the parts, and in order to have the parts, we need to have part possessor, the owner of the parts. The part possessor and the parts are dependent on each other. So maybe the frame or whatever it is. Now, if there is no part possessor in the first place, we cannot have parts, Because parts of the car, we call it. We don't call it parts of a parts. So if there is no car, what's the parts for? Parts of what? Parts of nothing. So when there are no parts, shape becomes impossible, because the shape in question must be the shape of the parts. So it is impossible for the mere shape to be the card, because parts do not have existence without depending on the parts possessor. Yeah. part possessor, So this is what we're talking about, the jigsaw puzzle. If you don't have the board or the floor, you even all the pieces of puzzle is not a puzzle. You can think it's a puzzle, but you can't see the shape of it. Can't see the shape of it. I have somebody gave me a jigsaw puzzle in a box, those big boxes, and it says Buddhist Wheel of Life. I've been there maybe 5 years, still hasn't become one. When you look at it, yeah, it's there. But when you look at so many pieces, who want to do that? Am I some sort of deluded person who has nothing better to do and can't pass his time? Or do I have a little child or to mind? Then I might be spared to do that. Otherwise, it's just sitting there in pieces. It's never realize that. Why? Because there's no part possessor or one who want to make it. So it's like that. So that's really very important. People think it's all he did it, but then it's what's your problem? See, if he did it, then what's your problem? See, you are the part possessor. You are the part possessor. Because you're a part possessor, then you think he didn't do this, he did this to me, he wasn't good to do. So then all these things, because we are the part possessor. So no matter how many parts they played, but it still is not the whole thing. If there is no I or no ego that actually relates to it or makes a assessment or judgment, so the ego is the center of all the things. So it's talking about how the imputation is. Yeah, but if there is no owner of the parts, there is no parts, neither the shape or simple pattern constitute. This is in fact referring to the shape of all the parts. In order to have a shape, we must have the existence of the parts. In order to have the parts, we need to have part possessor, owner of the parts. The part possessor and the parts are dependent on each other. So this is the big point. Everything is dependent. Nothing truly exists. So when it says there's no I, no ear, it doesn't mean there's no I. No. It means there's no I that independently is I without an eye socket. Without a head on which the eye sits. Because eye on the head looks, people say, oh, you got a beautiful eye. They say that. But if that eye is on a plate or something, people get fried. People get fried. I'm sorry. Maybe maybe we shouldn't say this on air. But I will, because there's no real thing, We had a few visitors a couple of days ago. One of the visiting monks, I thought he had only one eye. He's just like this, and I thought maybe he didn't have the left eye at all. So the eye that was looking was really bright and beautiful. And then all of a sudden he opened the other one. I got frightened. Some people have that kind of eye, yeah? It's like all of a sudden open. It's just as big as the other one. It just doesn't stay open for that long. It's like getting used to it, So you think there's only one eye. All of a sudden the second one pops, and because we done exactly it was there. But otherwise it's already always there. Just I was looking. It was really. I thought it was magical eye or whatever, but no. And then he went back again for whatever it's worth. It's quite amazing. So like that, If the thing is, there, if you ran fast on that final day, then you run for your fastest runner. But if you ran the other times, it's not. So fastest runner or whatever, you can do many times fast runner, but nobody counts. It's only on that day when everybody is lining, and then you might be the fast runner. So it shows that it's totally dependent on other things. Itself is not fastest runner, because word fastest runner expects many other runners. You can't run by yourself, and you can't say, I'm fastest runner. Maybe you can. Maybe you can. I'm fastest runner. And you can talk to him. I told you. Nobody's taking heed to you because nobody's there. See? So everything's like that. It's only in relation to something else. Then the I might be I. So I is only I. It's on the right part of the relatively right part of the body. But if you are born with the eye over the shoulder, will be people. Oh gosh, they will call deformed or something. Imagine, say you have no eye here, but one eye here. It'll take a while for society to get used to. So they will put under the strange but true existent things. Strange but true, but they don't think it's real, normal. See, we don't know how many things props up the thing. The thing itself is nothing unless there's the props. Yeah. So all the things that props up, and we need to know what are propping those things. What are the things that props up? If there are no parts, shape become impossible. The eye doesn't become possible to look like eye. It looks like a kind of, somebody's eye is in the ball or something. You're scared. It's impossible. Impossible. The shape in question must be shape of parts. If it's impossible for this, so it is impossible for the mere shape to be the card, because parts do not have existence without depending on part possessor. Part possessor. Second, the shape of the individual part is also not the horse card. Yeah. So that's very important. That 2 lines. In the 2 lines we have already dealt with, the reference was to mere shape of parts collectively. Now the next 2 lines negate the proposition that the shape of individual part is the horse card. Yeah, if the shape you mean is what was early in the parts, supposedly remaining there when now the chariot is perceived. This is shown. This is shown by next 2 verses. Yeah, we got to do that. Chewari Cuba Delachit, Chewari Cuba Teda Lachitar, Tedarayani Hingda Yumayin. Tala Tata Kalte Hingda Nidunder, Ponlo Sole, Ipta Deyonas, and the Zunjuna Tea Yumente, Teje Ipsan Hingda Yumayin. How is it that there is no chariot when the parts are disassembled? And even now there is no chariot present. If within the chariot that's here and now assembled, the wheels and so forth have assumed a different shape, this fact would be perceived, but it is not. Therefore, shape alone is not the chariot. So, according to you, the shape of each part is the same, whether it is assembled into a cart or whether it is left as pieces, whether the wheel is assembled in with other pieces or whether the wheel is left alone, it will have the same shape. So if the shape of the individual pieces is the same now as before being assembled, then before being assembled there was no cart. Yeah. So that means that all the other pieces have to give up their shape, their individual shape, to the cart. This is very good, isn't it? Selfless pieces. Selfless non-banana makes banana cake. All banana receive all the name and fame. All the selfless white flour and soda and butter and all the cook's effort and no unsung hero. They're selfless. There's no change with respect to the shape, but assembly they would form a different shape. Yeah. So all the pieces have given up their identity. They become camouflaged with the rest of the things. Yeah, if there are two different shapes of the wheel, this should be visible, but it's not. You can't see the banana in the banana cake. So there's no banana, but still there's a banana. People think it's truly existing banana cake. But banana never make cake, even if they're very ripe. Maybe you can make banana lassi. But even then you need all the lassi making things. There's no banana. This is the other day I was thinking, banana. When the banana's ripe, you should make banana cake. We don't want a banana cake. Then what do you want to make lassi? It's even more complicated. So there's no truly existing useful ripe banana. when you don't want to bring all the other parts, when you don't want all that. I haven't got that one. Shop's closed. Takes 20 minutes. Then no parts. No parts. If there were two different shapes of the wheel, this should be visible, but it's not. No longer. It is by the time it's assembled, it completely has taken the whole cart shape. It hasn't got any of the other individual parts there. So this is how mountain's created. Mountain of ego is created. It's just we don't realize our mother's sweat and tears, all of the fathers' sweat and tears, all of the kind people, all the people who help us, brought us up and trained and taught and educated, and this has made this person. But we still think I'm truly existing. Me, it's all me. It's all my hard-earned. My hard-earned sweat and tear. They call it. Develop the grasping to things, and then fight against the brothers and sisters. And maybe even the person who gave them. Terrible, isn't it? Terrible. Human beings can be like that. They just develop this mountain of ego over these things, and they don't realize that everything is made from many, many parts. That's why Tibetan Buddhist monks perform the mandalas. They make sand mandalas, and first they have only white sand, and then they bring a couple of packets of paint, and then they divide the sand up, and yellow, red, blue, and then yellow also light one, and so on, red also pink, and so on. So there may be like 20 little containers, 20 different colors, and an empty floor. Then they put this, and then they draw this. Mandala looks wonderful, but they call it Kala Chakra mandala or whatever mandala, but they don't. But there's no mandala in any of the particles. Even if you sweep the whole sand and you put in your bag you carry, there's no mandala. That mandala is only when it's spread on those particular particles and the colors in that separate location in relation to the other. Then there is a mandala, but there is no actual mandala. Even in the whole sand that you sweep, still there's no mandala. Very good teaching. Because we get attached to the collection as truly existing thing. Be that your feelings, be that your success or failure, or emotions, or your physical things, or shape, or form, or height, or weight, or people think that's me, and there's lots of people suffering. It's all about them not having the right shape, Them not like Michael Jackson. He just can't have the right assemblage of his nose, or whatever, Or he really tries very hard to look white, didn't he? Try to look very white, As part of teaching, I can say this not to laugh at him or anybody, yeah. As an analogy, they talk about Devadatta, so we can use, because Devadatta nobody knows, Michael Jackson everybody knows. So when the person is attached to his form and think that's him, and lots of people's suffering comes from their image and color and height or form or slimness or lack of it, and then they put on weight unnecessarily by themselves, and they try to take it off unnecessarily under the knife. Putting on with knife and fork, and then to carve with some different kind of knife. They didn't realize they didn't realize these things you eat will become part of the fat. Those parts we don't know. They don't look like sugar. Then once they go in, doesn't look like sugar. They become fat. So the mere shape is not the cart. If it were to be the cart, we would have the cart even before assembly. You don't have to assemble. So assembling is also part of the cart. Assembling is also part of the cart. So what are all those factors that contributed? Everything must be inclusive. This inclusivity is called middle path. Middle path doesn't exist unless it includes both rightists and leftists. It's middle because it has to include right and left. It's exclusive when you don't include either. Then it tries to be that. So, just as there is no card in the previous shape, there should not be a card at the time of collection, even if it's. So why there is a collection? There is a card after assembly, and why we assemble? Because we have concept, we have label, imputing, we calling it. Unless we call it, even the card is all assembled. It says, oh, what is it? Oh, I haven't got the name. You need that Mercedes-Benz logo there. Even the engines, everything Mercedes. We have to wait until that comes. We have to label it. So the shape is not the card. But when people have the mountain of ego grasping to that, they actually mistakenly think the shape is the card. Shape is the card. They don't include assembling it. They don't think of the concept, the labeling it, and all these factors. So we will conclude here. I don't know how many cards you got to play. So